I'm scared, but I think I'm about to find some friends. Looks after Oliver and proceeds with his adventures. Wolves tear your throats, muttered Sykes, grinding his teeth. I wish I was among some of you. You'd howl the hoarser for it. As Sykes growled forth this imprecation with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee, turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighboring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. "Stop, you white-livered hound!" cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. "Stop." The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sykes was in no mood to be played with. "Bear a hand with the boy," roared Sykes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back!" Toby made a show of returning, but ventured in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. "Quicker!" cried Sykes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. "Don't play the booby with me." At this moment the noise grew louder, and Sykes, again looking round, could discern that the men who'd given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. "It's all up, Bill," cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show 'em your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail, and darted off at full speed. Sykes clenched his teeth, took one look round, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met it at a right angle, and, whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone. There's something about this voice that's very flirtatious. "Ho ho there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher, Neptune, come here, come here!" The dogs, which in common with their masters seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to this command, and three men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together. "My advice, or leastways I should say my orders, is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again." "I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles," said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face, and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. "I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man, "and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him. No, no, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation. To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke." "You are afraid, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. "I ain't," said Brittles. "You are," said Giles. "You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles," said Brittles. "You're a lie, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. Now these four retorts arose from Mr. Giles' taunt, and Mr. Giles' taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close most philosophically. "I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," said he. "We're all afraid." "Speak for yourself, sir," said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party. "So I do," replied the man, It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am." "So am I," said Brittles, "only there's no call to tell a man he is, so bounceably." These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all three faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity, till Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, and was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted upon stopping to make an apology for his hastiness of speech. "But it's wonderful," said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of the rascals." As the other two were impressed with a similar presentiment, and their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of the sudden change in their temperament. "I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate." "I shouldn't wonder if it was," exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea. "You may depend upon it," said Giles, that gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it." By a remarkable coincidence, the other two had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment, so that it was quite conclusive that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the very instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars and a traveling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse. It's my job to keep all of them alive, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion, and Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the three men hurried back to a tree, behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, it might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exultation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways and low places were all mire and water, and the damp breath of an unwholesome wind. The damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by, with a hollow moaning. Still Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing as its first dull hue. The death of night, rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down thick and fast and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes, but Oliver felt it not, as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side, and the bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he had done so, he looked feebly round for help, and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man, but he kept up nevertheless, and with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward. He knew not whither. And now, hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as they had done the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them by, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms, and there rose into the air loud cries and shouts. Lights gleamed before his eyes, and all was noise, tumult, as some unseen hand borne him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined test, uneasy consciousness of pain which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of gates, or through hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road, and here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Seeing his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall! On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night, and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very same house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place that for the instant he forgot the agony of his wound, and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, where could he fly to? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that about this time Mr. Giles, Riddles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles' habit to admit to too great familiarity the humbler servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary make all men equals, as do cold feet, and Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and housemaid who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, "or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3, when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so, Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes. I fancied I heard a noise. At this point in the narrative, the cook turned pale and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first, this is illusion, and was composing myself off to sleep when I heard the noise again, distinct." "What sort of noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of a busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittles. "It was when you heard it, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles, "but at this time it had a busting sound. I turned down the clothes," continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, sat up in bed, and listened. I have a note. I have a note. All this talk of being awake when you're asleep in this Oliver Twist story. The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated, "Lord!" and drew their chairs closer together. "I heard it now, quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody," I says, "is forcing of a door or window. What's to be done? I'll call up that poor lad Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat," I says, "may be cut from his right ear to his left, without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker, and stared at him with his mouth wide open, and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of—" "Ladies present, Mr. Giles," murmured the tinker. "Of shoes, sir," said Giles, turning upon him and laying a great emphasis on the word. "Seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. 'Brittles,' I says, when I had woke him, 'don't be frightened.' 'So you did,' observed Brittles in a low voice. 'We're dead men, I think, Brittles,' I says," continued Giles, "but don't be under any alarm." "Was he frightened?" asked the cook. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Giles. "He was as firm, pretty near as firm as I was." "I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me," observed the housemaid. "You're a woman," retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. "Brittles is right," said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. "From a woman nothing else was to be expected, but we, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittles' hob, and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so." Mr. Giles had risen from his seat and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to company his description. With appropriate action. With appropriate. With appropriate action. When he started violently in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair, The cook and housemaid screamed. "It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. Nobody likes this. Nobody likes me. With appropriate. It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning, said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear somebody?" Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he rendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles, after a short silence, "I'm ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party, being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made, on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs with the dogs in front, and the two women who were afraid to stop below bringing up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master-stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions immediately, with appropriate, having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed, and the group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy?" exclaimed Mr. Giles, violently pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the... What? Brittles, look here. Don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry of recognition. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall, and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is," bawled Giles, calling in a great state of excitement up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am. Here's a thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light." "In a lantern. Lantern, lantern, lantern. In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth, so that his voice might travel the better. The two women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavoring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hung. In the midst of all this noise and commotion there was heard a sweet female voice, which quailed it in an instant. "Giles!" whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush!" replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt almost as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature severely hurt?" "Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles, with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he was a-going, miss," bawled Brittles in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should—" "Hush! Pray, there's a good man," rejoined the young lady. "Wait quietly one instant while I speak to my aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away, and soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles' room. That's a beautiful sentence. For the reader, for the writer. And that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and doctor. "But won't you take one look at him first, miss?" said Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss." "Not now for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, if it's only for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs, with the care and solicitude of a woman. As an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver resorted, and relates what they thought of him in a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some halfway between the sideboard and the breakfast table, and with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back, and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left, hung down by his side grasping a waiter, looked like one who labored under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner with her hands folded on the table before her, and her eyes, of which age had dimmed but little of their brightness, attentively fixed upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be without impiety supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17. Cast in so slight and exquisite a mold, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eye and was stamped upon her noble head seemed scarcely of her age or of the world. And yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humor, the thousand lights that played about the face and left no shadow there, above all the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were twice entwined, with the best sympathies and affections of her nature. Not to say our nature. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table, and chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her, playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into one beaming look such a gush of affection and artless loveliness that blessed spirits might have smiled to be so handsome. Look upon her. The elder lady smiled, but her heart was full, and she brushed away a tear as she did so. "And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has she?" asked the old lady after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch which he drew forth by a black ribbon.
If ever angels be for God's good purposes, enthroned in mortal forms. He is always slow, remarked the old lady. Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am, replied the attendant, and seeing by the by that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. He gets worse instead of better, I think, said the elder lady. It is very inexcusable in him if he stops to play with any other boys. Boys, said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and, getting quickly into the house, by some mysterious process, burst into the room, and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together. I never heard of such a thing, exclaimed the fat gentleman. My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of night, too? I never heard of such a thing. With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves. You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright, said the fat gentleman. Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, or I myself and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody. I'm sure, under such circumstances, dear, so unexpected, in the silence of night, too. The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected and attempted in the night-time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment by the 2-penny post a day or two previous. And you, Miss Rose, said the doctor, turning to the young lady. I. Oh, very much so indeed, said Rose, interrupting him. But there is a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see. Ah, to be sure, replied the doctor. So there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand. Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had had that honor. Honor, eh? Said the doctor. Well, I don't know. Perhaps it's as honorable to hit a thief in a back kitchen as to hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air, and you fought a duel, Giles. Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for the like of him that it was not for the fight for him, that it was not for the fight for him, that it was not for the fight for him, that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party. God, that's true, said the doctor. Where is he? Show me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window that he gone in at, eh? Well, I couldn't have believed it. Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs. And while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Losberne, a surgeon in the neighborhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as the doctor, had grown fat more from good humor than from good living, and was as kind and beautiful, not to say hearty, and withal as eccentric and old bachelor as will be found tested 5 times that space by any explorer alive. You're on, Dickens. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious and closed the door carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door as if to keep it shut. "He is not in danger, I hope," said the old lady. "Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is. Have you seen this thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady. "Nor heard anything about him?" "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Mr. Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losborne came in." The fact was that Mr. Giles had not at first been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery that he could not for the life of him help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished in the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." Rejoined the doctor. "There's nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him enemy presence in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I'm quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so, if you postponed it. He's perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me?" "Not the slightest fear, I pledge you my honor." With many more loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them with much ceremony and stateliness upstairs. "Now," said the doctor in a whisper as he softly turned the handle of a bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he doesn't look at all ferocious notwithstanding. Stop, though. Let me see that he is in visiting order first." Stepping before them, he looked into the room, and motioning them to advance, closed the door. The doctor's business. When they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed, upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bounded and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast, and his head reclined upon the other, which was half hidden by his long hair as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand, and looked on for a minute or so in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face, and as she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known, as a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odor of a flower, or even the mention of a familiar word, will some time call Pop Dad. Sudden, dim remembrances of scenes that never were in this life, which vanish like a breath, in which some brief memory sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were in this life, which vanish like a breath, and which some brief memory of a happier existence long gone by would seem to have awakened, for no power of the human mind can ever recall them. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers." "Vice," sighed the doctor, replacing the curtain takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her? But at so early an age, urged Rose. My dear young lady, rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head, crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims. But can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society? Said Rose anxiously. The surgeon shook his head in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment. But even if he had been wicked, pursued Rose, think how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or even the comfort of a home, when that ill usage, blows, or the want of bread may have driven him to herd with the men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake, think of this before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh, as you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late. My dear love, said the older lady, elder lady, as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom. Do think I would harm a hair of his head? Oh, no, replied Rose eagerly. Not you, aunt, not you. No, said the old lady with a trembling lip. My days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir? Let me think, ma'am, said the doctor. Let me think. Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of, I've got it now, and no, I haven't, and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt and spoke as follows. I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles and that little boy Brittles, I can manage it. He is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that? Unless there is some other way of preserving the child, replied Mrs. Mayley. There is no other, said the doctor. No other. Take my word for it. Then aunt invests you with full power, said Rose, smiling through her tears. But pray don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary. You seem to think, retorted the doctor, that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted today except yourself. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the very first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion. And I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself on the spot of such a favorable opportunity for doing so as the present. You're as great a boy as poor Brittles himself, returned Rose, blushing. Well, said the doctor, laughing heartily, that is no very difficult matter. But to return to this boy, the great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say, and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation, that I shall examine him in your presence, and that if from what he says we judge, and I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reason that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate, without any further interference on my part, at all events. Oh, no, aunt, entreated Rose. Oh, yes, aunt, said the doctor. Is it a bargain? He cannot be hardened. Thank you. Is it a bargain? How can he ask that? He cannot be hardened in vice, said. It is impossible. Very good, retorted the doctor, tested. Then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition. Finally, the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereto sat down to wait with some impatience until Oliver should wake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losberne had led them to expect, for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he had at length roused sufficiently to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one, for Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear, in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child, recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if, when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error. The dark evidences of human error, which, appropriate, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising slowly, it is true, but not less surely to heaven to pour their after-vengeance on our heads. If we heard but one instant in imagination the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by woman's hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner ended. Older woman, concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again. Then the doctor, after wiping his eyes and condemning them in the usual phrase for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles, and finding nobody about the parlors, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen, so into the kitchen he went. There were assembled in that lower house of the domestic parliament the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half-boots, and looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the doctor entered, and Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Mrs. wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and disposed for company, I am taking mine among 'em here." Brittles headed a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express underhanded express The train, the train, the train defense, the train, the train, the train defense. The gratification they derived from Mr. Giles' condescension. And Mr. Giles looked around with a patronizing air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would never desert them. "How's the patient tonight, sir?" asked Giles. "So," returned the doctor. "I'm afraid you've got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Mr. Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die. If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off, no, not even Brittles here, not for all the plate of the country, sir." "That's not the point," said the doctor mysteriously. "Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant?" "Yes, sir, I hope, sir," faltered Mr. Giles, who had turned very pale. "And what are you, boy?" said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles. "Lord bless me, sir," replied Brittles, starting violently. "I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir." "Then tell me this," said the doctor fiercely. Both of you, are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come, we are prepared for you." The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. "Pay attention to the reply, constable, will you?" said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. "Something must come of this before long." The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. "It's a simple question of identity, you will observe," said the doctor. "That's what it is, sir," replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way. "Here's a house broken into," said the doctor, "and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy in the midst of gunpowder smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness. Here's a boy comes to that very same house next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, those men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in a great danger, and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is whether those men are justified by the fact, and if not, what situation do they place themselves in?" The constable nodded profoundly, and said that if that wasn't law, he should be glad to know what was. "I ask you again," thundered the doctor, "are you on your solemn oaths able to identify that boy?" Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles. Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles. The constable put his hand behind his ear to catch the reply. The two women and the tinker leant forward to listen, and the doctor glanced keenly round, when a ring was heard at the gate, and at that same moment the sound of wheels. "It's the runners!" cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle. "Me and Mr. Giles sent for 'em this morning." "What?" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles. "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wondered they weren't here before, sir." "You did you? Then confound and damn your slow coaches down here, that's all," said the doctor, walking away. Oliver's destiny, continuing unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky, well-cured bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed. Weighed down by fetters and misfortunes, And in the next scene, his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold with throbbing bosoms, the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And just as our expressions are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we're straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals, who are free of all sorts of places from church vaults to palaces, and roam about in company, carolling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they're by no means unnatural. The transitions in real life, from well-spread boards to deathbeds, and from mourning weeds to holiday garments, are not a whit less startling, only that we are busy actors instead of passive lookers-on, which makes a vast difference. Parentheses. The actors in the mimic life of the theater are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling, which, presented before the eyes of mere spectators, are at once condemned as outrageous and preposterous. Are you a Protestant? As sudden shiftings of the scene and rapid changes of time and place are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered, my mom would want me to apologize, that was really rude, as the great art of authorship. An author's skill in his craft being by such critics chiefly estimated with the relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of almost every chapter. This brief introduction to the present one may perhaps be deemed unnecessary, but I have set it in this place because I am anxious to disclaim at once the slightest desire to tantalize my readers by leaving young Oliver Twist in situations of doubt and difficulty, and then flying off at a tangent to impertinent matters which have nothing to do with him. My sole desire is to proceed straight through this history with all convenient dispatch, carrying my reader along with me if I can, and if not, leaving him to take some more pleasant route for a chapter or two, and join me again afterwards if he will. Indeed, there is so much to do, that I have no room for digressions, even if I possessed the inclination. The Dickensian uses of and. It's mysterious. I merely make this one in order to set myself quite right with the reader, between whom and the historian it is essentially necessary that perfect faith should be kept, and a good understanding preserved. The advantage of this amicable explanation is that when I say, as I do now, that I am going back directly to the town in which Oliver Twist was born, the reader will at once take it for granted that I have good and substantial reasons for making the journey. Or I would not ask him to accompany me on any account. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate and walked with portly carriage and commanding step up the high street. He was in the full bloom and pride of beetleism. His cocked hat and coat were dazzling in the morning sun, and he clutched his cane with all the vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was an abstraction in his eye and an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beetle's mind too great for utterance. Mr. Bumble stopped to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him deferentially as he passed along. He merely returned their salutations with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not in his dignified pace until he reached the farm where Mrs. Mann tended the infant paupers with a parish care. "Drat that beetle," said Mrs. Mann, hearing the well-known impatient shaking at the garden gate. "If it isn't him at this time in the morning. Look, Mr. Bumble, only think of its being you. Well, dear me, it is a pleasure, this is. Come into the parlor, sir, please." The first sentence was addressed to Susan, and the exclamations of delight were spoken to Mr. Bumble as the good lady unlocked the garden gate and showed him with great attention and respect into the house. "Mrs. Man," said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon or dropping himself into a seat, as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually and slowly down into a chair. "Mrs. Man, ma'am, good morning." "Well, and good morning to you, sir," replied Mrs. Man, with many smiles. "And hoping you find yourself well, sir?" "So, Mrs. Man," replied the beetle. "A parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Man." "Ah, that it isn't indeed, Mr. Bumble," rejoined the lady, and all the infant paupers might have chorused the rejoinder with great propriety if they had heard it. "A parochial life, ma'am," continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane, "is a life of worry and vexation and hardihood, but all public characters, as I may say, must suffer prosecution." Mrs. Man, not very well knowing what the beetle meant, raised her hands with a look of sympathy and sighed. "Ah, you may well sigh, Mrs. Man," said the beetle. Finding she had done right, Mrs. Man sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, "Mrs. Man, I am going to London." "Lawk, Mr. Bumble," said Mrs. Man, starting back. "To London, ma'am," resumed the inflexible beetle, "by coach. And I and 2 paupers, Mrs. Man. A legal action is coming on about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Mrs. Man, to depose to the matter before the quarter sessions at Clerkenwell. And I very much question," added Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up, "whether the Clerkenwell sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they've done with me." "Oh, you mustn't be too hard upon them, sir," said Mrs. Man coaxingly. "The Clerkenwell sessions have brought it upon themselves, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble. "And if the Clerkenwell sessions find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell sessions have only themselves to thank." There was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered himself of these words that Mrs. Man appeared quite awed by them. At length she said, "You're going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts." "That's when they're ill, Mrs. Man," said the beetle. "We put the sick paupers into open carts in the rainy weather to prevent their taking cold." "Oh," said Mrs. Man. "The opposition coach contracts for these 2 and takes them cheap," said Mr. Chumble. "They are both in a very low state, and we find it would come £2 cheaper to move 'em than to bury 'em. Please help us. That is, if we can throw 'em upon another parish, which I think we should be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us." "Uh-oh, I'm infected." When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave. "We are forgetting business, ma'am," said the beetle. "Here is your parochial stipend for the month." Wherewith Mr. Bumble produced some silver money, rolled up in paper, from his pocket-book, and requested a receipt, which Mrs. Man wrote. "It's very much blotted, sir," said the farmer of infants, "but it's formal enough, I dare say. Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir. I'm very much obliged to you, I'm sure." Mr. Bumble nodded blandly in acknowledgment of Mrs. Man's curtsy, and inquired how the children were. Breast, brother. "Bless their dear little hearts," said Mrs. Man with emotion. "They're as well as can be, the dears. Of course, except the 2 that died last week. And little Dick." "Isn't that boy no better?" inquired Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann shook her head. "He's a ill-conditioned, vicious, bad-disposed, parochial child, that," said Mr. Bumble angrily. "Where is he?" "I'll bring him to you in 1 minute, sir," replied Mrs. Mann. "Here, you, Dick!" After some calling, Dick was discovered, and having his face put under the pump and dried upon chocolate, stuff some chocolate in his mouth, make him smile against his better senses. Chocolate, chapter the 18th. Chocolate teeth. How Oliver passed his time in the improving society of his reputable friends. About noon next day, when Dodger and Master Bates had gone out to peruse their customary avocations, Mr. Fagin took the opportunity of reading Oliver a long lecture on the crying sin of ingratitude, of which he clearly demonstrated he had been guilty to no ordinary extent in wilful absenting himself from the society of his anxious friends, and still more in endeavoring to escape from them after so much trouble and expense had been incurred in his recovery. Mr. Fagin laid great stress on the fact of his having taken Oliver in and cherished him. Without having his timely aid, he might have perished with hunger, and related the dismal and affecting history of a young lad whom in his philanthropy he had succored under parallel circumstances, but who, proving unworthy of the confidence and evincing a desire to communicate with the police, had unfortunately come to be hung at the Old Bailey one morning. Mr. Fagin did not seek to conceal his share in the catastrophe, but lamented with tears in his eyes that the wrong-headed and treacherous behavior of the young person in question had rendered it necessary that he should become the victim of certain evidence for the Crown, which, if it were not precisely true, was indispensably necessary for the safety of him, Mr. Fagin, and a few select friends. Mr. Fagin concluded by drawing a rather disagreeable picture of the discomforts of hanging, and with great friendliness and politeness of manner expressed his anxious hope that he might never be obliged to submit Oliver Twist to that unpleasant operation. Little Oliver's blood ran cold as he listened to the angel's words, and imperfectly comprehended the dark threats conveyed in them, that it was possible even for justice itself to confound the innocent with the guilty when they were in accidental companionship, he knew already, and that deeply laid plans for the destruction of inconveniently knowing or over-communicative persons. Oh no, I'm gonna sing, I know it, had been really devised and carried out by the old faith Jew on more occasions than one. He thought by no means unlikely. I don't like it. Carried out by Mr. Fagin on more occasions than one. He thought by no means unlikely, when he recollected the general nature of the altercations between that gentleman and Mr. Sikes, which seemed to bear reference to some foregone conspiracy of the kind, as he glanced timidly up and met Mr. Fagin's searching look. He felt that his pale face and trembling limbs were neither unnoticed nor unrelished by the wary villain. The angel, the enemy presence, smiled hideously, and patting Oliver on the head, said that if he kept himself quiet and applied himself to business, he saw they would be very good friends yet. Then taking his hat and covering himself up in an old patched greatcoat, he went out and locked the room door behind him. And so Oliver remained all that day, and for the greater part of many subsequent days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight, and left during the long hours to commune with his own thoughts, which, never failing to revert to his kind friends and the opinion they must long ago have formed of him, were sad indeed. After the lapse of a week or so, the angel left the room door unlocked. Door unlocked, and he was at liberty to wander about the house. It was a very dirty place, but the rooms upstairs had great high wooden mantelpieces and large doors, which panelled walls and cornices to the ceilings, which, although they were black with neglect and dust, were ornamented in various ways, from all of which tokens Oliver concluded that a long time ago, before Davy Crockett was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free, raised in the woods so he knew every tree, killed him a bar when he was only 3. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier, fought single-handed through the Injun War, till the Creeks was whipped and peace was restored. While he was handling this risky chore, made himself a legend forevermore. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. He give his word and he give his hand that his Injun friends could keep their land, and the rest of his life he took the stand that justice was due every redskin band. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. He went off to Congress and served a spell, fixing up the government and laws as well. Took over Washington, so we heard tell, and patched up the crack in the Liberty Bell. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. It had belonged to better people, and perhaps been quite gay and handsome, dismal and dreary as it looked now. Spiders had built their webs in the angles of the walls and ceilings, and sometimes, when Oliver walked softly into a room, the mice would scamper across the floor and run back terrified to their holes. With these exceptions, there was neither sight nor sound of any living thing, and often when it grew dark and he was tired of wandering from room to room, he would crouch in the corner of the passage by the street door to be as near living people as he could, and to remain there listening and trembling until the angel or the boys returned. In all the rooms, the moldering shutters were fast closed, and the bars which held them were screwed tight into the wood, the only light which was admitted making its way through round holes at the top, which made the rooms more gloomy, and filled them with strange shadows. There was a back garret window, with rusty bars outside, which had no shutter, and out of which Oliver often gazed with a melancholy face for hours together, but nothing was to be descried from it but a confused and crowded mass of housetops, blackened chimneys, and gable ends. Sometimes, indeed, a ragged grisly head might be seen peering over the parapet wall of a distant house, but it was quickly withdrawn again, and as the window of Oliver's observatory was nailed down and dimmed with the rain and smoke of years, it was as much as he could do to make out the forms of the different objects beyond, without making any attempt to be seen or heard, which he had as much chance of being as if he had been inside the ball of St. Paul's Cathedral. One afternoon, the Dodger and Master Bates being engaged out that evening, the first-named young gentleman took it into his head to evince some anxiety regarding the decoration of his person, which, to do him justice, was by no means an habitual weakness with him. And with this end and aim, he condescendingly commanded Oliver to assist him in his toilet straightway. Oliver was but too glad to make himself useful, too happy to have some faces, however bad, to look upon, and too desirous to conciliate those about him, when he could honestly do so, to throw any objection in the way of this proposal. So he at once expressed his readiness, and kneeling on the floor, while the Dodger sat upon the table so that he could take his foot in his lap, he applied himself to a process which Mr. Dawkins designated as japanning his trotter cases, and which phrase, rendered into plain English, signifieth cleaning his boots. Whether it was the sense of freedom and independence which a rational animal may be supposed to feel when he sits on a table in an easy attitude, smoking a pipe, swinging one leg carelessly to and fro, and having his boots cleaned all the time without even the past trouble of having taken them off, or the prospective misery of putting them on, to disturb his reflections, or whether it was the goodness of the tobacco that soothed the feelings of the Dodger, or the mildness of the beer that mollified his thoughts, he was evidently tinctured for the nonce with a spice of romance and enthusiasm foreign to his general nature. He looked down on Oliver with a thoughtful countenance for a brief space, and then, raising his head and heaving a gentle sigh, said, half in abstraction and half to Master Bates, "What a pity it is he isn't a prig." "Ah," said Master Charlie Bates, "he don't know what's good for him." The Dodger sighed again and resumed his pipe, as did Charlie Bates, and they both smoked for some seconds in silence. "I suppose you don't even know what a prig is," said the Dodger mournfully. "I think I know that," replied Oliver, hastily looking up. "It's you're one, are you not?" inquired Oliver, checking himself. "I am." "The circumference of your head. I am." "Conscious ecology. I am." This comma, this apostrophe, this letter R. "I am," replied the Dodger. "I'd scorn to be anything else." Mr. Dawkins gave his hat a ferocious cock after delivering this sentiment, his dying words, and looked at Master Bates as if to denote that he would feel obliged by his saying anything to the contrary. "I am," repeated the Dodger. "So's Charlie, so's Fagin, so's Sykes, so's Nancy, so's Bet, so we all are, down to the dog, and he's the downest one of the lot." "And the least given to peaching," added Charlie Bates, in black ribbon. "He wouldn't so much as bark in a witness box for fear of committing himself. No, not if you tied him up in one, and left him there without victuals for a fortnight," said the Dodger. "That he wouldn't, not a bit of it," observed Charlie. "He's a rum dog. Don't he look fierce at any strange cove that laughs or sings when he's in company?" pursued the Dodger. "Won't he growl at all when he hears a fiddle playing? And don't he hate other dogs as ain't of his own breed? Vinkin! Oh, no." "He's an out-and-out Christian," said Charlie. This was merely intended as a tribute to the animal's abilities, but it was an appropriate remark in another sense. "Oh, you really..." "I don't know. I don't appreciate a good joke. If Master Bates had only known it. For there are a great many ladies and gentlemen claiming to be out-and-out Christians. If Tahani al-Jamil had only known it, for there are a great many ladies and gentlemen claiming to be out-and-out Christians, between whom and Mr. Sykes' dog there exist very strong and singular points of resemblance." "Well, well," said the Dodger, recurring to the point from which they had strayed, with that mindfulness of his profession which influenced all his proceedings. "This hasn't got anything to do with young Green here." "No more it has," said Tahani. "Why don't you put yourself under Fagin, Oliver, and make your fortune out of hand?" added the Dodger with a grin. "And so be able to retire on your property and do the Gentile, as I mean to in the very next leap year, but 'fore that ever comes, and the 42nd Tuesday in Trinity Week," said Tahani al-Jamil. "I don't like it," rejoined Oliver timidly. "I wish they would let me go. I would rather go." "And Fagin would rather not," rejoined Tahani. Oliver knew this too well, but thinking it might be dangerous to express his feelings more openly, he only sighed and went on with his boot cleaning. "Go!" exclaimed the Dodger. "Why, where's your spirit? Don't you take any pride out of yourself? Would you go and be dependent on your friends, eh?" "Oh, blow that," said William to Honey, breaking 2 or 3 silk handkerchiefs from his pocket and tossing them into a cupboard. "That's too mean, that is." "I couldn't do it," said the Dodger with an air of haughty disgust. "You can leave your friends, though," said Oliver with a half-smile, "and let them be punished for what you did." "That," rejoined the Dodger with a wave of his pipe, "that was all out of consideration for Fagin, because the traps know that we work together, and he might have got into trouble if we hadn't made our lucky. That was the move, wasn't it, to Honey?" Master Bates nodded assent, and would have spoken, but that the recollection of Oliver's flight came so suddenly upon him that the smoke he was inhaling got twice entangled, with a laugh, and went up into his head and down into his throat, and brought on a fit of coughing and stamping about 5 minutes long. "Look awake here," said the Dodger, drawing forth a handful of shillings and halfpence. "Here's a jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold. There's plenty more where they were took from. You won't you?" "Oh, you precious flat." "It's naughty, ain't it, Oliver?" inquired Horoscope. Horoscope with a W at the front. "He'll come to be scragged, won't he?" "I don't know what that means," replied Oliver, looking round. "Something in this way, old feller," said Charlie. In parentheses, as he said it, Master Bates caught up an end of his neckerchief, and holding it erect in the air, dropping his head on his shoulder, jerked an incurious sound through his teeth, thereby indicating by a lively pantomimic representation that scragging and hanging were one and the same thing. "That's what it means," said, end parentheses, Charlie. "Look how he stares, Jack. I never did see such prime company as this 'ere boy. He'll be the death of me, I know he will." And Master Charles Bates, laughing heartily again, resumed his pipe with tears in his eyes. "You've been brought up bad," said the Dodger, surveying his boots with much satisfaction when Oliver had polished them. "Fagin will make something of you, though, or you'll be the first he ever had that turned out unprofitable. You'd better begin at once, for you'll come to the trade long before you think of it, and you're only losing time, Oliver." Master Bates backed his advice. Is it his advice, or is it this advice? The book says, Master Bates backed this advice with sundry moral admonitions of his own, moral admonitions of his own, which being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dawkins launched into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favor without more delay by the same means which they had employed to gain it. The next paragraph is a puzzle. Dickens has a note, and I wrote a note. What I think Dickens' note is Book the Third, Chapter the Third. Quote, "The girl obeyed, and Sikes, locking her hand in his, fell back upon the pillow, turning his eyes upon her face. They closed." And the note I wrote, "This is impossible. To read it is too much commented upon. It's Mrs. Bedwin. It's Milton's Angels. It's, quote, scarce. So it is Huckleberry and Virginia Woolf. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Well, here's that paragraph. And always put this in your pipe, Nolly, said the Dodger, as the Jew was heard unlocking the door above. If you don't take foggles and tickers... For some reason, I find that very hard. What's the good of talking in that way? Interposed Master Bates. He don't know what you mean. Ensure domestic tranquility. If you don't take pocket hankers and watches, said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity, some other cove will, so that the coves that lose 'em will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse too, and nobody half a hapworth the better, except the chaps what's got 'em, and you've just as good a right to them as they have. To be sure, said the angel, who had entered unseen by Oliver. It's all lies in the nutshell, my dear, in a nutshell. Take the Dodger's word for it. Ha ha! He understands the catechism of his trade. The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning in these terms, and chuckled with delight at his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no further at this time, for Mr. Fagin had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy and a gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but who was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance. Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards that young gentleman, which seemed to indicate that he felt himself conscious of a slight inferiority in point of genius and professional acquirements. He had small twinkling eyes and a pockmarked face, wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, liked to be listened to, didn't care if he was understood, greasy fustian trousers and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was only out an hour before, and that in consequence of having worn the regimentals for 6 weeks past, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with strong marks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedy against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting the hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 mortal long hard-working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he wasn't as dry as a lime-basket. "Where do you think the gentleman has come from, Oliver?" inquired the angel in my presence. It sounds like angel enemy presence, but we're not going that way, with a grin, as the other boys put a bottle of spirits on the table. I don't know, sir," replied Oliver. "Who's that?" inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver. "A young friend of mine, my dear," replied the angel. "He's in luck, then," said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin. "Never mind where I came from, young'un. You'll find your way there soon enough, I'll bet a crown." At this sally the boys laughed, and after more jokes on the same subject, exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin, and withdrew. After some words apart between the last comer and Fagin, they drew their chairs towards the fire, and the angel, telling Oliver to come and sit by him, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, fear, the proficiency of the Dodger, fear, the amiability of Charlie Bates, fear, and the liberality of the man himself, fear. God, maybe fear of the word Jew. At length these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted, and Mr. Chitling did the same, for the house of correction becomes fatiguing after a week or two. Accordingly, Miss Betsy withdrew and left the party to their repose. From this day, Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with the two boys, who played the old game with Cupid every day. Whether for their own improvement or Oliver's, Mr. Fagin best knew. At other times the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much that was droll and curious that Oliver could not help laughing heartily, and showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings. In short, the wily old had the boy in his toils, and having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place, was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. Going on to the next chapter of this book, it was a chill, damp, windy night when the Irishman, buttoning his great coat tight round his shriveled body and pulling the collar up over his ears so as completely to obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighborhood of Whitechapel. Cupid stopped for an instant at the corner of the street, and glancing suspiciously round, crossed the road and struck off in the direction of Spittle Fields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as an angel to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on this course, his course, through many winding and narrow ways, until he reached Bethnal Green. Then, turning suddenly off to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of the mean, dirty streets which abound in that close and densely populated quarter. Mr. Fagin was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed, however, to be at all bewildered either by the darkness of the night or the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleys and streets, and at length turned into one lighted only by a single lamp at the farther end. At the door of a house in this street he knocked, and having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened the door, walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of the door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill, only me, my dear," said Mr. Fagin, looking in. "Bring in your body," said Sikes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got a great coat on?" Apparently the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as Mr. Fagin unbuttoned it and threw it over the back of a chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went, to show that he was well satisfied, as it was in his nature to be. "Speech, speech, speech." "Well?" said Sikes. "Well, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin. "Oh, Nancy." The latter recognition was uttered with just enough of embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met since she had interfered in behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were however speedily removed by the young lady's behavior. She took her feet off the fender, pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin drew up his without saying any more about it, for it was a cold night, and no mistake. Miss Nancy prefixed to the word cold another adjective, derived from the name of an unpleasant instrument of death, which, as the word is seldom mentioned to ears polite in other form than a substantive, I have omitted in this chronicle. "It is cold, Nancy dear," said Mr. Fagin as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his left side. "It must be a piercer if it finds its way through your heart," said Mr. Sikes. "Give him some to drink, Nancy. Burn my body, make haste. It's enough to turn a man ill to see his lean old carcass shivering in that way, like an ugly ghost just rose from the grave." Nancy quickly brought a bottle from a cupboard in which there were many, which, to judge from the diversity of their appearance, were filled with several kinds of liquids, and Sikes, pouring out a glass of brandy, bade Mr. Fagin drink it off. "Quite enough, quite, thank you, Bill," replied Mr. Fagin, putting down the glass after just setting his lips to it. "What? You're afraid of getting the better of you, are you?" inquired Sikes, fixing his eyes on Mr. Fagin. "Ugh." With a hoarse grunt of contempt, Mr. Sikes seized the glass and emptied it, as a preparatory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. Mr. Fagin glanced round the room as his companion tossed down the second glassful, not in curiosity, for he had seen it often before, but in a restless and suspicious manner which was habitual to him. It was a meanly furnished apartment with nothing but the contents of the closet to induce the belief that its occupier was anything but a working man, and with no more suspicious articles displayed to view than 2 or 3 heavy bludgeons which stood in a corner, and a life-preserver that hung over the mantelpiece. "There," said Sikes, smacking his lips. "Now I'm ready." "For business, eh?" inquired Mr. Fagin. "For business," replied Sikes. "So say what you've got to say." "About the crib at Chertsey, Bill," said Mr. Fagin, drawing his chair forward and speaking in a very low voice. "Yes, what about it?" inquired Sikes. "Ah, you know what I mean, my dear," said Mr. Fagin. "He knows what I mean, Nancy, don't he?" "No, he don't," sneered Mr. Sikes. "Or he won't, and that's the same thing. Speak out and call things by their right names. Don't sit there winking and blinking and talking to me in hints as if you weren't the very first that thought about the robbery. Damn your eyes. What do you mean?" "Hush, Bill, hush," said Mr. Fagin, who had in vain attempted to stop this burst of indignation. "Somebody will hear us, my dear, somebody will hear us." "Let 'em hear," said Sikes. "I don't care." But as Mr. Sikes did care, upon reflection he dropped his voice as he said the words, and drew calmer. There, said Mr. Fagin. Mr. Figuring it out. Mr. Fagin. Coaxingly. "It was only my caution, nothing more. Now, my dear, about that crib at Chertsey. When is it to be done, Bill? When's it to be done?" "Such plate, my dear, such plate," said Mr. Fagin, rubbing his hands and elevating his eyebrows in a rapture of anticipation. "Not at all," replied Sikes coldly. "Not to be done at all?" echoed Mr. Fagin, leaning back in his chair. "No, not at all," rejoined Sikes. "At least, it can't be a put-up job as we expected." "Then it hasn't been properly gone about," said Mr. Fagin, turning pale with anger. "Don't tell me." "But I will tell you," retorted Sikes. "Who are you that's not to be told? I tell you that Toby Crackit has been hanging about the place for a fortnight, and he can't get one of the servants into a line." "Do you mean to tell me, Bill," said Mr. Fagin, softening as the other grew heated, "that neither of the two men in the house can be got over?" "Yes, I do mean to tell you so." They're Protestants." "I hope that was funny," replied Sykes. "The old lady has had them these 20 year, and if you were to give 'em £500, they wouldn't be in it." "But do you mean to say, my dear," remonstrated Mr. Fagin, "that the women can't be got over?" "Not a bit of it," replied Sykes. "Not by Flash Toby Crackit?" said Mr. Fagin incredulously. "Think what women are, Bill." "No, not even by Flash Toby Crackit," replied Sykes. "He says he's worn sham whiskers and a canary waistcoat the whole blessed time he's been loitering down there, and it's all no use." "He should have tried mustachios and a pair of military trousers, my dear," said Mr. Fagin after a few moments' reflection. "So he did," rejoined Sykes, "and they weren't of no more use than the other plant." So he did, rejoined Sykes, "and they weren't of no more use than the other plant." Mr. Fagin looked very blank at this information, and after ruminating for some minutes with his chin sunk on his breast, raised his head and said with a deep sigh that if Flash Toby Crackit reported aright, he feared the game was up. "And yet," said the old man, dropping his hands on his knees, "it's a sad thing, my dear, to lose so much when we had set our hearts upon it." "So it is," said Mr. Sykes. "Worse luck." A long silence ensued, during which Mr. Fagin was plunged in deep thought, with his face wrinkled into an expression of villainy perfectly demoniacal. Sykes eyed him furtively from time to time, and Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire, as if she had been deaf to all that passed. "Fagin," said Sykes, abruptly breaking the stillness that prevailed, "is it worth 50 shiners extra if it's safely done from the outside?" "Yes," said Mr. Fagin, suddenly rousing himself as if from a trance. "Is it a bargain?" inquired Sykes. "Yes, my dear, yes," rejoined Mr. Fagin, grasping the other's hand, his eyes glistening, and every muscle in his face working with the excitement that the inquiry had awakened. "Then," said Sykes, thrusting aside Mr. Fagin's hand with some disdain, "let it come off as soon as you like." "Then," said Sykes, thrusting aside the angel's hand with some disdain, "in my presence, enemy presence, let it come off with appropriate as soon as you like. Toby and I were over the garden wall the night before last, sounding the panels of the doors and shutters. The crib's barred up at night like a jail, but there's one part we can crack safe and softly." "Which is that, Bill?" asked Mr. Fagin eagerly. "Why," whispered Sykes, "as you cross the lawn—" Yeah, said Mr. Fagin, bending his head forward with his eyes almost starting out of it. "Ugh," cried Sykes, stopping short as the girl, scarcely moving her head, looked suddenly round and pointed for an instant to Mr. Fagin's face. "Never mind which part it is. You can't do it without me, I know, but it's best to be on the safe side when one deals with you." "As you like, my dear, as you like," replied Mr. Fagin, biting his lip. "Is there no help wanted but yours and Toby's?" "None," said Sykes, "except a centre bit and a boy. The first we've both got, the second you must find us." "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Fagin. "Oh, then it is a panel, eh?" "Never mind what it is," replied Sykes. "I want a boy, and he mustn't be a big un." "Lord," said Mr. Sykes reflectively, "if I'd only got that young boy of Ned, that chimbley sweeper's. He kept him small on purpose, and let him out by the job. But the father gets lagged, and the Juvenile Delinquent Society comes and takes the boy away from a trade where he was earning money, teaches him to read and write, and in time makes apprentice of him. And so they go on, said Mr. Sikes in his wrath, rising with the recollection of his wrongs. So they go on, and if they'd got enough money, which it's a providence they have not, we shouldn't have half a dozen boys left in the whole trade in a year or two. No more we should, acquiesced Mr. Fagin, who had been considering during the speech and had only caught the last sentence. Bill. What now? Inquired Sikes. Mr. Fagin nodded his head toward Nancy, who was still gazing at the fire, and intimated by a sign that he would have her told to leave the room. Sikes shrugged his shoulders impatiently, as if he thought the precaution unnecessary, but complied, nevertheless, by requesting Miss Nancy to fetch him a jug of beer. You don't want any beer, said Nancy, folding her arms and retaining her seat very composedly. I tell you I do, replied Sikes. Nonsense, rejoined the girl coolly. Go on, Fagin. I know what he's going to say, Bill. He needn't mind me. Mr. Fagin still hesitated, and Sikes looked from one to the other in some surprise. Why, you don't mind the old girl, do you, Fagin? He asked at length. You've known her long enough to trust her, or the devil's in it. She ain't one to blab, are you, Nancy? I should think not, replied the young lady, drawing her chair up to the table and putting her elbows upon it. No, no, my dear, I know you're not, said Mr. Fagin, but... And again the old man paused. But what? Inquired Sikes. I didn't know whether she might perhaps be out of sorts, you know, my dear, as she was the other night, replied Mr. Fagin. At this confession, Miss Nancy burst into a loud laugh, and swallowing a glass of brandy, shook her head with an air of defiance, taught them what it means to speak softly, and burst into sundry exclamations of keep the game going, never say die, and the like, which seemed at once to have the effect of reassuring both gentlemen, for Mr. Fagin nodded his head with a satisfied air, and resumed his seat, as did Mr. Sikes likewise. Now, Fagin, said Miss Nancy with a laugh, tell Bill at once about Oliver. Ah, you're a clever one, my dear, the sharpest girl I ever saw, said Mr. Fagin, putting her on the neck. It was about Oliver I was going to speak, sure enough. Ha ha! What about him? Demanded Sikes. He's the boy for you, my dear, replied Mr. Fagin in a hoarse whisper, laying his finger on the side of his nose and grinning frightfully. He? Exclaimed Sikes. Have him, Bill, said Nancy. I would if I was in your place. He mayn't be so much as any of the others, but that's not what you want if he's only opened a door for you. Depend upon it, he's a safe one, Bill. I know he is, rejoined Fagin. He's been in good training these last few weeks, and it's time he began to work for his bread. Besides, the others are all too big. Well, he is just the size I want, said Mr. Sikes, ruminating. And will do everything you want, Bill, my dear, interposed Mr. Fagin. He can't help himself. That is, if you only frighten him enough. Frighten him? Echoed Sikes. It'll be no sham frightening, mind you. If there's anything queer about him when we once get into the work, in for a penny, in for a pound, you won't see him alive again, Fagin. Think of that before you send him. Mark my words, said the robber, shaking a heavy crowbar which he had drawn from under the bedstead. I've thought of it all, said Mr. Fagin with energy. I've had my eye upon him, my dears. Close. Close. Once let him feel that he's one of us. Once fill his mind with the idea that he's been a thief, and he's ours. Ours for his life. Oh, I couldn't have come about better. The old man crossed his arms upon his breast, and drawing his head and shoulders into a heap, literally hugged himself for joy. Ours, said Sikes. Yours, you mean? Perhaps I do, my dear, said Mr. Fagin with a shrill chuckle. Mine, if you like, Bill. And what, said Sikes, scowling fiercely on his agreeable friend, what makes you take so much pains about one chalk-faced kid, when you know there are 50 boys snoozing about Common Garden every night, as you might pick and choose from?
"Because they're of no use to me, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin with some confusion. "Not worth the taking, for their looks convict 'em when they get into trouble, and I lose 'em all. With this boy properly managed, my dears, I could do what I couldn't with 20 of them. Besides," said Mr. Fagin, recovering his self-possession, "he has us now if he could only give us leg bail again. And he must be in the same boat with us. Never mind how he came there, it's quite enough for my power over him that he was in a robbery. That's all I want. Now, how much better this is than being obliged to put the poor little boy out of the way, which would be dangerous, and we should lose by it besides." "When is it to be done?" asked Nancy, stopping some turbulent exclamation on the part of Mr. Sikes, expressive of the disgust with which he received Fagin's affectation of humanity. "Ah, to be sure," said Mr. Fagin. "When is it to be done, Bill?" "I planned with Toby the night after tomorrow," rejoined Sikes in a surly voice, "if you heard nothing from me to the contrary." "Good," said Mr. Fagin. "There's no moon." "No," rejoined Sikes. "It's all arranged about bringing off the swag, is it?" asked Mr. Fagin. Sikes nodded. This is troubling. Is Sikes all about sovereignty, or is he all about psyche? And about... it's all planned, rejoined Sikes, interrupting him. "Never mind particulars. You'd better bring the boy here tomorrow night. I shall get off the stones an hour after daybreak. Then you hold your tongue and keep the melting pot ready, and that's all you'll have to do." After some discussion in which all three took an active part, it was decided that Nancy should repair to Mr. Fagin's next evening, when the night had set in, and bring Oliver away with her. Fagin craftily observing that, if he evinced any disinclination to the task, he would be more willing to accompany the girl, who had so recently interfered in his behalf, than anybody else. It was also solemnly arranged poor Oliver should, for the purposes of the contemplated expedition, unreservedly consigned to the care and custody of Mr. William Sikes, and further, that the said Sikes should deal with him as he thought fit, and should not be held responsible by Mr. Fagin for any mischance or evil that might befall the boy, or any punishment with which it might be necessary to visit him, and being understood that, to render the compact in this respect binding, any representations made by Mr. Sikes on his return should be required to be confirmed and corroborated in all important particulars by the testimony of Flash Toby Crackit. These preliminaries adjusted, Mr. Fagin lets on even more evidence he needs Oliver to be an alive criminal. It's a weird motive. Mr. Sikes proceeded to drink brandy at a furious rate and to flourish the crowbar in an alarming manner, yelling forth at the same time most unmusical snatches of song, mingled with wild execrations. At length, in a fit of professional enthusiasm, he insisted upon producing his box of housebreaking tools, which he had no sooner tumbled in with and opened for the purpose of explaining the nature and properties of the various implements it contained, and the peculiar beauties of their construction, than he fell over it upon the floor, and went to sleep where he fell. "Good night, Nancy," said Mr. Fagin, muffling himself up as before. "Good night." Their eyes met, and Mr. Fagin scrutinized her narrowly. There was no flinching about the girl. She was as true and earnest in the matter as Toby Crackit himself could be. Mr. Fagin again bade her good night, and bestowing a sly kick upon the prostrate form of Mr. Sikes, while his friend had her back turned, groped downstairs. "Always the way," muttered Mr. Fagin to himself as he turned homewards. "The worse
of these women is that a very little thing serves to call up some long-forgotten feeling, and the best of them is, and that it never lasts. The man against the child for a bag of gold. Beguiling the time with these pleasant reflections, Mr. Fagin wended his way through mud and mire to his gloomy abode, where the Dodger was sitting up, impatiently awaiting his return. "Is Oliver abed? I want to speak to him," was his first remark as they descended the stairs. "Hours ago," replied the Dodger, throwing open a door. "Here he is." The boy was lying fast flat as the coat around Fagin's body. The boy was lying fast asleep on a rude bed upon the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness and the closeness of his prison that he looked like death, not death as it shows in shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when a young and gentle spirit has but an instant fled to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not had time to breathe upon the changing dust it hollowed. "Not now," said Mr. Fagin, turning softly away. Tomorrow. I ought to read chapter the 20th, chapter the 21st. However, they're so powerfully done. Maybe about a surah from the Quran. I don't feel as if I can deliver that. I gotta write that out, think it over.